Hey guys, tonight we are stepping away from the thunderous pronouncements of Zeus and the dramatic escapades of Hera, and instead, we're going to peek behind the gilded curtains of Mount Olympus, down into the quieter corners of the ancient Greek world. Imagine for a moment, not the epic battlefields or the grand temples, but a dusty path winding through olive groves, the distant bleating of sheep, and the rhythmic chirping of cicadas under a warm Mediterranean sun. You're not witnessing a hero's triumphant return or a god's fiery wrath. You're simply observing the everyday, almost mundane, existence of deities who, frankly, had to deal with their own version of cosmic chores. You probably won't survive the sheer unexcitement of it all. But then again, that's kind of the point, isn't it? We're aiming for maximum tranquility, minimum drama. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, maybe share in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to imagine all of us scattered across the globe, drifting off to the same sleepy tales. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You might assume that being a Greek deity meant constant feasts, endless adoration, and maybe a few well-placed lightning bolts to liven things up. But for every Ares roaring on the battlefield, or every Aphrodite enchanting mortals, there were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of lesser-known divinities whose daily lives were, to put it mildly, less flashy. Think of them as the unsung heroes of the Greek pantheon, the cosmic civil servants who kept the intricate machinery of the world turning with surprisingly little fanfare. They weren't plotting against each other over who had the best golden apple, or turning mortals into trees for a casual slight. No, their days often consisted of duties that might remind you, just a little, of your own to-do list, albeit with a touch more immortality involved. Consider for a moment the concept of divine bureaucracy. While the big gods were busy with their grand narratives, someone had to manage the logistics of seasons changing, rivers flowing, and even the occasional misplaced thought in a mortal's mind. These minor deities, often overlooked in the grand, epic poems, were the ones making sure the sun still rose, the moon still waned, and that when you whispered a secret, the air around you carried it just so. It's a bit like imagining that while the CEO is off giving a TED Talk, there are dozens of middle managers ensuring the coffee machine is working and the supply closet is stocked. And in the divine hierarchy, a well-stocked supply closet might mean making sure the spring still flows clear, or that the gentle breeze carries the scent of time just right. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of minor deities truly reflected a granular understanding of the natural world, or if it was simply the ancient Greek mind's way of assigning divine oversight to every conceivable niche. You're about to discover it was probably a bit of both. Their responsibilities, though seemingly minor, were absolutely essential. Without them, the grand narratives of the Olympians would quickly unravel. Imagine a world where the quiet hum of nature simply stopped, or where the small, gentle forces that shape our everyday existence just didn't exist. It would be chaos, but not the exciting, dramatic chaos of a divine feud. Rather, the dull, frustrating chaos of things simply not working as they should. These are the gods of the subtle, the pervasive, the things you only notice when they're gone. They are the background hum, the gentle rhythm, the soft focus of the ancient world. You won't find them wielding tridents or riding chariots through the sky. More likely, you'll find them meticulously tending to a specific grove of trees, or perhaps ensuring that the dew falls just so on a particular patch of grass. Their power wasn't in grand displays, but in quiet, consistent presence. It's almost soothing. Let's drift now to Hestia, a goddess often overlooked in the more sensational myths. While her siblings were out conquering, seducing, or otherwise creating monumental messes, Hestia was quietly, diligently attending to the hearth. You might picture her as the cosmic homemaker, but that undersells her profound significance. In ancient Greece, the hearth wasn't just a place to cook dinner. It was the sacred center of the home, the city, and even the Olympian Council. Every meal, every gathering, every oath sworn in a Greek household revolved around the fire in the hearth. It was the enduring symbol of stability, warmth, and community. And Hestia was its gentle, unwavering guardian. Imagine Hestia's day. You don't see her leading armies or inspiring grand works of art. Instead, you'd find her, perhaps, ensuring the flames in every human dwelling flickered just so, providing enough warmth without turning into a raging inferno. Think of the meticulous precision required. Just the right amount of wood, the perfect airflow, a consistent glow. It's not exactly thrilling, is it? More like a divine fire warden, always on duty. She was the deity you invoked when you wanted your dinner to cook evenly, or when you simply craved the comforting presence of a crackling fire on a chilly evening. No dramatic quests, no heroic battles, just the quiet, eternal hum of domestic well-being. Her presence was less about direct intervention and more about pervasive influence. When you lit a fire in your home, Hestia was there, a silent witness, ensuring the elemental balance. She didn't demand sacrifices or grand temples in the same way Zeus did. Her worship was integrated into the fabric of daily life. Every meal shared, every family gathering around the fire, was an act of reverence to Hestia. It's like imagining a modern-day deity of Wi-Fi stability. You don't see them, but you certainly notice when they're not doing their job. And Hestia was the ultimate stable connection. You could almost hear a gentle sigh of contentment from her as the smoke curled just right from a humble cooking fire. One quirky tidbit about Hestia is that she swore an oath of eternal virginity, even rejecting the advances of both Poseidon and Apollo. While other goddesses were embroiled in countless romantic entanglements and divine dramas, Hestia simply chose a life of quiet devotion to her duties. She traded personal drama for cosmic responsibility, a trade-off many of us might find surprisingly appealing on a Tuesday morning. It meant less gossip for the other gods, but far more consistent warmth for humanity. Historians still argue whether her virginity symbolized purity or simply her profound dedication to the hearth, making her immune to the typical Olympian squabbles. But you, as you drift deeper into sleep, can appreciate the sheer tranquility of a goddess who simply chose to keep things cozy. Her impact, though subtle, was foundational. Without the hearth, the ancient Greek family unit, the very basis of their society, would have struggled to exist. Hestia was the quiet glue, the consistent presence that made the chaos of mortal life manageable, providing a safe, warm anchor. She was the goddess you forgot about until you needed a quiet evening by the fire, or when you moved into a new home and wanted to light the first symbolic flame. Her power wasn't flashy. It was simply there, like the comforting rhythm of your own breathing. She rarely left Olympus, preferring the steady, predictable glow of the central hearth. And in a world filled with unpredictable gods, Hestia offered the ultimate reassurance. Some things, like the warmth of home, are constant. Now, let's tiptoe into the rustic domain of Pan, the god of wild groves, shepherds, and mountain wilds. If Hestia was the serene keeper of the indoor flame, Pan was the chill, sometimes surprisingly startling, guardian of the great outdoors. You probably know him by his goat legs, horns, and charmingly unkempt beard. But forget the images of him chasing nymphs through sun-dappled glades. For much of his immortal existence, Pan was simply there. He was the quiet rustle in the reeds, the sudden chill breeze that makes the hairs on your arms stand up, or the distant, almost musical bleating of sheep. Imagine a typical day for Pan. He's not orchestrating grand Olympic councils or participating in divine love triangles. More often than not, he's probably perched on a sun-warmed rock, idly observing a flock of sheep, or perhaps tending to a particularly stubborn patch of wild thyme. His responsibilities were largely pastoral and remarkably low-key. He ensured the herds were healthy, the pastures lush, and that the wild places remained wild. It's less about dramatic action and more about maintaining the gentle equilibrium of nature. You might hear him playing his panpipes, but not for an audience of adoring gods. More likely, it's just for his own amusement or to soothe a nervous goat. One quirky detail about Pan is his famous panic. While he could inspire sudden, irrational fear in travelers, this wasn't usually an act of malicious intent. Think of it more as a byproduct of stumbling unawares into his domain. It's like accidentally startling a very large, horned badger. The resulting chaos isn't planned, it's just a reaction. So, if you were a lone traveler in ancient Greece and suddenly felt an inexplicable dread while passing through a quiet forest, it wasn't necessarily a monster. It was probably just Pan minding his own business, and you happened to disturb his afternoon nap. It's the ancient equivalent of someone suddenly appearing in your personal space, and you jumping back in surprise. Pan's presence was deeply woven into the lives of shepherds and anyone who ventured into the wilderness. They didn't build elaborate temples to him, but they would leave small offerings at rustic shrines or in caves, simple tokens of gratitude for healthy flocks and safe passage. You might offer a small piece of cheese or perhaps a fresh sprig of pine, a quiet acknowledgement of his watchful, if somewhat aloof, guardianship. His power wasn't in commanding armies, but in ensuring the delicate balance of the natural world, allowing animals to graze peacefully and plants to flourish. It's a bit like being the quiet, behind-the-scenes manager of a very large, very green park. Historians still argue whether Pan's image as a lustful, chasing deity evolved later than his more fundamental role as a protector of herds, reflecting changing societal views of wilderness and masculinity. But for tonight, you can simply imagine him as the gentle, somewhat eccentric spirit of the countryside, content in his solitude, ensuring the wild places retained their charm. He was the deity who understood the profound peace of a quiet afternoon spent watching clouds drift by, or the simple joy of a perfectly formed mushroom popping up after a gentle rain. His influence was felt in the subtle scent of pine needles, the gentle rustle of leaves, and the quiet contentment of a flock of sheep. A life less dramatic, perhaps, but certainly more conducive to a good night's rest. Let's now consider Eris, the goddess of discord. You might think of her as a chaotic force, always stirring up trouble with grand, dramatic gestures. But for much of her existence, Eris's work was far more subtle, a quiet art of gentle nudges and whispered suggestions. She wasn't throwing lightning bolts or orchestrating epic battles. Instead, she was perfecting the delicate craft of the well-placed, mildly inconvenient truth or the slightly misremembered comment. Her influence was more akin to a stray pebble in your shoe than a meteor crashing to Earth. Imagine Eris's typical day. She isn't out there inciting wars between nations. She's probably ensuring that two close friends subtly misunderstand each other over a trivial matter. Perhaps she quietly rearranges a few words in a message, or lets a small, unspoken annoyance fester just a little longer than it should. Her goal wasn't destruction, but rather the quiet hum of friction, a low-level static that kept things from becoming too harmonious. After all, if everything was perfectly calm and peaceful, what would be the point of anything? It's like being the cosmic editor who just adds a single, perplexing typo to an otherwise perfect sentence, simply to keep you on your toes. You wouldn't even notice her working, only the slightly off-kilter feeling that followed. One quirky tidbit about Eris is how often her biggest impact came from the absence of something, rather than its presence. Her most famous act, the Golden Apple of Discord, wasn't thrown with a dramatic flourish. Instead, she simply tossed it into a wedding she wasn't invited to, bearing the inscription "to the fairest." Then she just left. The resulting argument between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite that eventually led to the Trojan War wasn't her direct doing. It was the ripple effect of a single, well-placed, glittering object. She merely provided the catalyst and let human nature do the rest. It's the ancient equivalent of sending an anonymous text message that says, "Just saw your partner with someone, don't worry about it," and then switching off your phone. Pure, subtle genius. Eris was the master of the small inconvenience, the minor annoyance, the subtle undermining of perfect tranquility. You wouldn't find grand temples dedicated to her. Who wants to worship a goddess of mild irritation? But her presence was felt whenever a polite conversation took an awkward turn, or when a perfectly good plan suddenly encountered an unforeseen, minor snag. Her power wasn't in commanding armies, but in planting the tiny seeds of doubt or disagreement that, given time and human nature, would often blossom into something larger. Historians still argue whether Eris truly embodied abstract discord, or if her myths simply personified the inherent human tendency toward conflict. But for you, as you drift into slumber, just imagine her as the quiet orchestrator of those moments when you can't quite put your finger on why things feel a little off. Her influence was like a persistent, low-frequency hum in the background of existence. She rarely made grand pronouncements, preferring the soft whispers of misunderstanding or the quiet glint of envy in an eye. She was the deity you didn't invoke, but whose presence you felt whenever a quiet evening threatened to become too quiet, and a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor of disharmony would ripple through the air. A goddess of quiet chaos, ensuring life was never too boring, but never so dramatic that you couldn't still catch a few hours of sleep. Next, we turn our attention to Nemesis, the goddess of divine retribution and righteous indignation. Now, don't imagine her as a vengeful fury, dramatically swooping down from the heavens with a flaming sword. For much of her existence, Nemesis operated with a serene, almost detached precision, ensuring that a cosmic balance was maintained. Her work was about restoring equilibrium, not exacting brutal revenge. Think of her as the universe's quiet accountant, meticulously tallying debits and credits in the great ledger of fate. Imagine Nemesis's typical day. She's not leading a charge against the arrogant or the cruel. Instead, you'd probably find her gently nudging circumstances, subtly shifting events to ensure that overweening pride met its appropriate downfall, or that undeserved good fortune eventually found its quiet counterpoint. Her influence was more like a slow, inexorable current than a crashing wave. She was the reason a boastful king's perfectly planned feast might unexpectedly be ruined by a swarm of gnats, or why a truly kind individual might find a lost purse on a quiet street. It's less about immediate, dramatic punishment and more about the quiet, inevitable turning of the cosmic wheel. You wouldn't see her. You'd only observe the strangely apt coincidence that seemed to bring things back into line. One quirky detail about Nemesis is her association with the measurement of fate. She wasn't about destroying lives, but about ensuring that no one had too much of a good thing or too little of a bad thing, if that bad thing was earned. She was particularly attentive to hubris, excessive pride, or arrogance that defied the gods. For Nemesis, hubris wasn't just a character flaw. It was a cosmic imbalance that simply had to be corrected. So, if you were an ancient Greek boasting endlessly about your unparalleled good looks or your vast fortune, you might notice a sudden, inexplicable rash, or perhaps misplace your favorite tunic. Nemesis wouldn't curse you. She'd just ensure a gentle, humbling setback. It's the divine equivalent of your phone battery, dying just when you're about to show off your vacation photos. Nemesis wasn't typically worshipped with grand sacrifices, but rather acknowledged through a quiet understanding of life's inherent fairness, or at least its tendency to self-correct. Her presence was felt in those moments when justice, however subtly, seemed to prevail, or when someone's unearned arrogance quietly backfired. Her power wasn't in wielding thunderbolts, but in orchestrating the subtle ironies of life that bring about a gentle rebalancing. Historians still argue whether the concept of Nemesis arose from a deep-seated desire for cosmic justice or simply as a way to explain the unpredictable ebb and flow of fortune. But for you, as you sink deeper into slumber, consider her as the quiet force that ensures the universe never stays out of whack for too long. Her influence was like a soft, pervasive murmur in the background of existence, a gentle reminder that every action has a reaction, and every imbalance eventually seeks equilibrium. She rarely made grand, public appearances, preferring to work behind the scenes, ensuring that the scales of fate were always gently, almost imperceptibly, tipping back towards balance. She was the deity you didn't explicitly pray to, but whose quiet presence you felt whenever a perfectly just outcome, or a subtly humbling setback, seemed to occur without any apparent cause. A goddess of quiet cosmic adjustments, making sure the world remained a predictable, if sometimes subtly inconvenient, place to drift off in. Let's now enter the realm of Morpheus, one of the Oneiroi, the winged sons of Hypnos, the god of sleep. While his father handled the broader domain of slumber, Morpheus had a much more specific and arguably more creative role. He was responsible for shaping and presenting dreams, particularly those involving human forms. You won't find him leading armies of slumbering mortals. Instead, picture him as the universe's most dedicated and perhaps most sleep-deprived cinematic director for your nocturnal adventures. Imagine Morpheus's typical day. He's not out there causing epic nightmares or weaving grand prophetic visions for kings. More often than not, he's meticulously crafting the seemingly mundane dreams that populate our sleep. Perhaps you're dreaming of a loved one, a familiar face from your past, or even a casual acquaintance you haven't thought about in years. That's Morpheus at work, diligently pulling the correct actor from the vast cast of human forms to inhabit your dreamscape. It's less about dramatic narrative and more about realistic character portrayal within the dream. Think of him as the ultimate casting director, ensuring the faces in your dreams are perfectly rendered down to the subtle nuances of their expressions. It's a quiet, painstaking job, ensuring that your dream version of your Uncle Fred looks exactly like your Uncle Fred. One quirky tidbit about Morpheus is his specialized focus. While his brothers, Phobter and Phantasos, dealt with nightmares and inanimate dream objects respectively, Morpheus was the master of human-shaped dreams. This meant he had to have an encyclopedic knowledge of every mortal's appearance and mannerisms, a database of human forms that would put any modern-day facial recognition software to shame. Imagine the cosmic filing system required for that. So, if you ever had a dream where a familiar face seemed eerily accurate, that was Morpheus's quiet dedication paying off. It's the divine equivalent of being an incredibly skilled portrait artist, but instead of paint and canvas, your medium is the fleeting landscape of a sleeping mind. Morpheus wasn't typically worshipped with grand temples or dramatic rituals. His influence was far too personal and ephemeral for that. Instead, his presence was acknowledged in the quiet awe of a vivid dream, or the comforting recognition of a familiar face appearing in your subconscious. His power wasn't in commanding sleep itself, but in giving it form, providing the visual elements that make our dreams feel so real. Historians still argue whether the concept of dream deities like Morpheus arose from an attempt to explain the randomness of dreams or a belief in their divine origin. But for you, as you sink deeper into your own dream world, you can appreciate the quiet diligence of a god whose sole purpose is to populate your unconscious narratives with perfectly rendered characters. His influence was like a soft, pervasive hum in the background of existence, ensuring that even when you drift off into the strangest scenarios, the faces you encounter feel authentic. He rarely made grand, public appearances, preferring to work behind the scenes, ensuring that the characters in your nightly stories were always convincingly cast. He was the deity you didn't explicitly pray to, but whose quiet presence you felt whenever a familiar face appeared in your sleep, a subtle nod to the intricate, often mundane, workings of the dream realm. A god of quiet visual fidelity, making sure your dreams were a comfortable, if sometimes oddly familiar, place to wander. Let's glide now to Iris, the graceful goddess of the rainbow and a primary messenger of the gods. You might picture her as a vibrant, kaleidoscopic figure, always appearing in a flash of color. But for the vast majority of her immortal life, Iris's duties were remarkably practical and, dare we say, rather quiet. She wasn't leading triumphant parades or delivering fiery declarations. She was simply the ancient world's most reliable and perhaps most understated postal service. Imagine Iris's typical day. She's not orchestrating grand celestial spectacles. She's probably delivering a mundane message from Hera to a minor nymph, or perhaps ensuring that a particular cloud delivered its rain to the correct olive grove. Her work was about efficient communication, a quiet, almost imperceptible bridge between the divine and the mortal realms. Think of her as the cosmic FedEx driver, always on schedule, always polite, and rarely drawing attention to herself. Her rainbow connection wasn't just a visual flourish. It was her practical path, a shimmering highway for her swift, often silent journeys. You wouldn't notice her flashy attire. You'd only perceive the message, delivered precisely and without fuss. One quirky tidbit about Iris is that she was also responsible for providing the Olympian gods with water from the river Styx, a task that sounds far more bureaucratic than majestic. Imagine her delicately scooping the powerful, oath-binding waters in a golden ewer, carefully transporting it back to Olympus. It's less like a divine mission and more like a very important, very precise errand. It's the ancient equivalent of being the only one trusted with the key to the executive washroom, ensuring everything is pristine and in its proper place. And she had to be quick. After all, divine thirsts wait for no one. Iris's presence was less about direct intervention and more about enabling the flow of information. She didn't often act on her own accord. She was a conduit, a whisper, a silent thread in the grand tapestry of divine and mortal interactions. You wouldn't find grand temples dedicated to her for her own sake, but her quiet efficiency was undoubtedly appreciated by any god or mortal who needed to send a reliable message. Her power wasn't in commanding forces, but in ensuring that words, and sometimes water, arrived exactly where they needed to be, swiftly and without error. Historians still argue whether her role as messenger reflects the importance of communication in ancient Greek society, or if she simply personified the fleeting beauty of natural phenomena like rainbows. But for you, as you drift deeper into sleep, you can appreciate the quiet diligence of a goddess whose job was simply to connect dots across the cosmos. Her influence was like a soft, pervasive hum in the background of existence, ensuring that important messages always found their way, even if those messages were about something as mundane as which particular goat needed divine assistance with a tricky fence. She rarely made grand pronouncements, preferring the swift, silent arc of her rainbow path. She was the deity you didn't explicitly pray to, but whose quiet presence you felt whenever a timely piece of news arrived, or when the world just seemed to connect perfectly without a hitch. A goddess of quiet connectivity, making sure information flowed smoothly through a very large, very ancient network. Let's now ease into the gentle embrace of Hypnos, the god of sleep itself. While his son, Morpheus, crafted the faces in your dreams, Hypnos was responsible for the quiet, pervasive blanket of slumber that descends upon the world each night. You won't find him battling awakeness or forcing consciousness to dim. Instead, picture him as the most benevolent of cosmic lullaby singers, a deity whose very presence brings profound peace. Imagine Hypnos's typical day. He's not out there actively putting individual mortals to sleep with a magical wand. His influence is far more subtle, a natural phenomenon that simply is. As the sun dips below the horizon, Hypnos's presence strengthens, quietly urging the world into repose. You don't see him. You simply feel the gentle tug of weariness after a long day, the delicious pull of eyelids growing heavy. His job is less about active intervention and more about pervasive, soothing influence. Think of him as the quiet orchestrator of the entire planet's collective bedtime, ensuring that every creature, from the mightiest hero to the smallest ant, eventually succumbs to the sweet oblivion of rest. He's the ultimate sleep aid, requiring no prescriptions or counting sheep. One quirky tidbit about Hypnos is his home in the underworld, in a dark cave where the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, flowed. This isn't a grim, terrifying place, but rather a space perfectly suited for profound rest, far from the clamor of the living world. The gentle murmur of the river, the absence of light, and the poppy fields around his abode all contribute to an atmosphere of deep, undisturbed peace. It's the divine equivalent of a perfectly soundproofed blackout bedroom, designed for ultimate relaxation. So, when you drift off tonight, imagine that quiet cave, miles away from any earthly disturbance. Hypnos wasn't typically worshipped with grand temples or fervent prayers. His arrival was simply an accepted, welcomed part of the natural cycle. His presence was felt whenever you succumbed to exhaustion, whenever the world seemed to slow down and hush itself for the night. His power wasn't in commanding armies, but in bringing the profound relief of rest to all beings, a universal balm for the weary. Historians still argue whether the personification of sleep as a deity like Hypnos arose from an attempt to understand a fundamental human need or a spiritual appreciation for the unconscious state. But for you, as you sink deeper into your own comfortable bed, you can appreciate the quiet benevolence of a God whose sole purpose is to bring you profound, restorative slumber. His influence was like a soft, pervasive hum in the background of existence, ensuring that the day's worries gently receded and the body found its natural rhythm of rest. He rarely made grand, public appearances, preferring the quiet, inevitable descent of twilight. He was the deity you didn't explicitly pray to, but whose quiet presence you felt whenever your body begged for rest, a subtle nudge towards the comforting oblivion of sleep, a god of quiet repose, making sure the world was a consistently peaceful place to drift off in. Now, let's consider Asclepius, the god of medicine and healing. You might envision him as a divine physician, performing miraculous cures with a flash of light and dramatic pronouncements. But for much of his existence, Asclepius's approach was surprisingly grounded, focusing on quiet observation, gentle remedies, and the patient pursuit of well-being. He wasn't about instant, flashy fixes. He was about the slow, steady path to recovery. Think of him as the ancient world's most dedicated, and perhaps most calming, general practitioner. Imagine Asclepius's typical day. He's not out there dramatically resurrecting the dead. Well, he did once, which got him in trouble with Hades, but that was an anomaly. More often than not, he's overseeing his temples, which functioned more like ancient sanitaria or holistic healing centers. You'd find him observing patients, perhaps listening to the gentle murmur of their breathing, recommending specific diets, soothing baths, or dream incubation rituals. His focus was on fostering an environment conducive to natural healing, not on grand, showy interventions. It's less about divine magic and more about practical, compassionate care. You wouldn't see him wielding a magical scalpel. You'd see him offering a comforting hand or a quietly insightful diagnosis. One quirky tidbit about Asclepius is his staff, around which a single snake is entwined, the symbol still used in medicine today. This isn't a symbol of venom or danger, but rather of renewal and healing, as snakes shed their skin. Asclepius often used non-venomous snakes in his healing rituals, allowing them to slither around the temple floors, believed to bring a calming, cleansing presence. So, if you were a patient in one of his temples, you might find yourself sharing your recovery space with a very quiet, very calm serpent. It's the ancient equivalent of a therapy animal, but with a bit more historical gravitas. Asclepius wasn't typically worshipped with boisterous festivals. Instead, his temples were places of quiet reverence and hopeful healing. His presence was felt in the slow improvement of a patient's condition, the gradual return of strength, or the comforting relief after a period of illness. His power wasn't in commanding forces, but in guiding the delicate process of restoration, both physical and mental. Historians still argue whether the cult of Asclepius represented an early form of scientific medicine or if it was primarily a spiritual healing practice. But for you, As you drift deeper into sleep, you can appreciate the quiet dedication of a god whose sole purpose was to bring comfort and recovery. His influence was like a soft, pervasive hum in the background of existence, ensuring that even in times of sickness, there was a path, however gentle, back to wellness. He rarely made grand, public pronouncements, preferring the quiet confidence of a well-tended patient. He was the deity you explicitly prayed to when you were unwell, but whose quiet presence you felt whenever your body began its slow, steady journey back to health. A subtle nod to the intricate, often mundane, workings of healing. A god of quiet restoration, making sure the world offered a consistently gentle path to recuperation. Now, let's explore Nike, the goddess of victory. When you hear victory, your mind likely jumps to grand Olympic triumphs, heroic battles, or world-shaking achievements. But for much of her immortal existence, Nike's influence was far more pervasive and, dare we say, delightfully mundane. She wasn't just there for the monumental wins. She was present in every small, quiet success, every tiny personal triumph that made up the fabric of daily life. Think of her as the quiet cheerleader of existence, acknowledging every small stride forward. Imagine Nike's typical day. She's not just fluttering over the finish line of a chariot race. She's probably ensuring that a young weaver finally untangles a particularly stubborn knot, or that a farmer successfully manages to plant a perfect row of seedlings. Her job was to acknowledge the subtle, everyday victories that often go unnoticed. It's less about dramatic acclaim and more about the quiet satisfaction of a task well done or a small obstacle overcome. You wouldn't see her with a laurel wreath every time. You'd feel a little surge of accomplishment, a quiet sense of, yes, I did it. One quirky tidbit about Nike is her frequent association with Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. Nike was often depicted alongside Athena, suggesting that victory wasn't just about raw power or brute force, but also about cleverness, planning, and perseverance. So, if you were an ancient Greek trying to figure out a particularly tricky puzzle, or attempting to convince a stubborn mule to move, a subtle sense of aha when you finally succeeded, that was Nike quietly acknowledging your small, intellectual victory. It's the divine equivalent of that satisfying click when you finally complete a complex Lego set. Nike wasn't typically worshipped with grand, standalone temples in the same way Zeus or Poseidon were. Her presence was often woven into the fabric of other deities' cults or acknowledged through small, personal offerings after a specific success. Her power wasn't in commanding armies, but in inspiring the quiet determination that leads to countless minor achievements. Historians still argue whether Nike was originally an independent deity or an attribute of other victorious gods, reflecting the pervasive nature of success in human endeavors. But for you, as you drift deeper into sleep, you can appreciate the quiet benevolence of a goddess whose sole purpose was to celebrate every little step forward. Her influence was like a soft, pervasive hum in the background of existence, ensuring that even the most seemingly insignificant efforts were met with a sense of quiet triumph. She rarely made grand, public pronouncements, preferring the subtle nod of approval, the gentle whisper of accomplishment. She was the deity you didn't explicitly pray to for every tiny success, but whose quiet presence you felt whenever you successfully threaded a needle on the first try, or managed to bake a perfect loaf of bread, a subtle nod to the intricate, often mundane, workings of everyday achievement. A goddess of quiet encouragement, making sure the world offered a consistently gentle pat on the back for every small win. Let's shift our focus to Hebe, the goddess of youth and the cupbearer to the gods on Mount Olympus. You might imagine her as a dazzling figure, constantly at the center of attention, serving ambrosia with dramatic flair. But for much of her immortal existence, Hebe's role was surprisingly practical, even domestic, and certainly less glamorous than the grand narratives of the Olympians often suggest. She was, in essence, the celestial server, ensuring the gods had their sustenance without fuss. Imagine Hebe's typical day. She's not out there inspiring eternal youth in mortals or participating in divine council meetings. More often than not, she's probably meticulously polishing golden goblets, ensuring the ambrosia is perfectly chilled, or perhaps carefully refilling a jug of nectar for a thirsty god. Her job was to provide the essential sustenance that kept the gods immortal and vibrant. It's less about dramatic displays of power and more about the quiet, consistent service that maintained the comfortable rhythm of Olympian life. You wouldn't see her performing miracles. You'd see her ensuring every deity's cup was full, a task that, while humble, was absolutely crucial to their endless existence. One quirky tidbit about Hebe is her eventual marriage to Heracles after he achieved apotheosis and joined the gods on Olympus. This wasn't a whirlwind romance born of grand adventures, but rather a quiet, almost understated union that brought Heracles into the domestic fold of Olympus. It suggests a more settled, less dramatic phase for both deities, a testament to Hebe's calming, grounding influence. It's the divine equivalent of settling down after a long career and finding joy in simple companionship. And perhaps, even for a hero, a quiet, well-served meal is preferable to another monster fight. Hebe wasn't typically worshipped with grand temples or fervent prayers, her duties being too utilitarian for widespread public cults. Instead, her presence was acknowledged in the smooth functioning of Olympian feasts, the quiet contentment of the gods, and the subtle, unchanging vitality of the celestial realm. Her power wasn't in commanding forces, but in sustaining the very essence of immortality through diligent service. Historians still argue whether Hebe's role as cupbearer symbolized the perpetual youth of the gods, or simply the mundane necessities of even divine existence. But for you, as you drift deeper into sleep, you can appreciate the quiet dedication of a goddess whose sole purpose was to keep the celestial household running smoothly. Her influence was like a soft, pervasive hum in the background of existence, ensuring that even the most powerful beings were well-nourished and content. She rarely made grand, public pronouncements, preferring the quiet efficiency of her service. She was the deity you didn't explicitly pray to for a drink, but whose quiet presence you felt whenever the gods were feasting in peaceful harmony, a subtle nod to the intricate, often mundane, workings of the divine home. A goddess of quiet sustenance, making sure the heavenly banquets proceeded without a single spilled drop. Let's now consider Tai Chi, the goddess of fortune, chance, and providence. When you hear fortune, you might immediately think of dramatic windfalls or catastrophic losses. But for much of her immortal existence, Tai Chi's influence was far more whimsical, subtle, and often quite unpredictable, operating on a spectrum of everyday occurrences rather than grand, life-altering events. She was less about destiny written in the stars and more about the gentle, almost imperceptible tilt of the cosmic dice in your daily life. Imagine Tai Chi's typical day. She's not orchestrating massive stock market crashes or bestowing lottery wins on unsuspecting mortals. More often than not, she's probably ensuring that you find that last perfect fig at the market, or that a sudden, unexpected gust of wind helps your sailing ship just a little. Her job was to infuse life with a touch of delightful randomness, the kind that makes you smile and say, "What are the odds?" It's less about dramatic divine intervention and more about the quiet, unexpected turns that make life interesting. You wouldn't see her. You just feel a tiny, inexplicable wave of luck, or perhaps a minor, equally inexplicable setback. One quirky tidbit about Tai Chi is her frequent depiction with a rudder, symbolizing her control over the course of events, and a cornucopia, representing the abundance of fortune she could bestow. Yet, she was also often shown as blindfolded or standing on a ball, signifying the unpredictable and often arbitrary nature of her gifts. So, while she could guide the ship of your life, she might do so with a playful, almost mischievous disregard for your precise plans. It's the divine equivalent of playing a game of chance where the rules are constantly, subtly shifting. Tai Chi was widely worshipped, not with grand, prescriptive rituals, but with a more casual, hopeful deference. People would offer small tokens of gratitude when good fortune smiled upon them, acknowledging her subtle hand in their daily lives. Her presence was felt in those moments when a seemingly random event perfectly aligned in your favor, or when a minor annoyance cleared up as if by magic. Her power wasn't in commanding armies, but in orchestrating the countless small coincidences that shape our perception of luck. Historians still argue whether the concept of Tai Chi reflected a fatalistic view of life or simply acknowledged the inherent unpredictability of human existence. But for you, as you drift deeper into sleep, you can appreciate the quiet charm of a goddess whose sole purpose was to add a touch of serendipity, or perhaps a hint of playful chaos, to your day. Her influence was like a soft, pervasive hum in the background of existence, ensuring that life was never entirely predictable, but always held the potential for a quiet, unexpected turn. She rarely made grand, public pronouncements, preferring the subtle wink of fate, the gentle nudge of circumstance. She was the deity you might casually acknowledge when something surprisingly good or mildly perplexing happened, a subtle nod to the intricate, often mundane, workings of fortune, a goddess of quiet chance, making sure the world was a consistently intriguing place to wander through. Let's now turn our attention to Echo, the nymph of the mountains and forests whose story is, quite literally, one of quiet repetition. You might think of her as a tragic figure, forever cursed to only repeat the last words spoken to her. But for much of her existence, Echo embodied a pervasive, gentle presence in the natural world, a subtle reminder that sounds linger, that voices reverberate, and that even silence holds a whispered memory. She was less about grand, dramatic pronouncements and more about the quiet, atmospheric persistence of sound. Imagine Echo's typical day. She's not actively seeking out conversations to mimic. Instead, she's simply being. Perhaps you're shouting a playful word across a valley, and a moment later, you hear it whispered back from a distant rock face. That's Echo, gently returning your own utterance, a soft, ethereal courtesy. Her existence is passive, a natural phenomenon rather than a deliberate act. It's less about intentional communication and more about the innate quality of certain landscapes to carry and bounce sounds. You wouldn't see her. You'd just experience the mysterious return of your own voice or the faint, repeated call of a bird. One quirky tidbit about Echo is her initial talkativeness, which led to her curse. She was once a vibrant, chatty nymph, so much so that Hera, trying to catch Zeus in an infidelity, cursed her to only repeat the last word spoken. This transformation from voluble chatterbox to quiet reverberation highlights a cosmic shift from direct interaction to subtle, lingering presence. So, when you hear an echo today, it's not just a physical phenomenon. It's a quiet echo of a past divine punishment, a gentle reminder that even curses can become a part of the natural, peaceful world. It's the ancient equivalent of a phone on silent mode, still there, but only responding when prompted. Echo wasn't typically worshipped with grand temples. Her presence was too diffuse, too inherent in the very fabric of nature. Instead, her influence was acknowledged in the quiet awe of a cavernous space, the playful mystery of a mountain valley, or the contemplative silence after a sound had faded, only to return softly. Her power wasn't in commanding forces, but in giving resonance to the world, ensuring that nothing truly vanished without leaving a trace. Historians still argue whether the myth of Echo arose from an attempt to personify a natural acoustic phenomenon or if it served as a cautionary tale about excessive talkativeness. But for you, as you drift deeper into sleep, you can appreciate the quiet persistence of a being whose sole purpose is to reflect the sounds and perhaps the tranquility of the world around her. Her influence was like a soft, pervasive hum in the background of existence, ensuring that even the quietest sounds found a way to linger subtly in the air. She rarely made grand, public appearances, preferring the subtle, almost imperceptible return of a whispered word. She was the deity you didn't explicitly pray to, but whose quiet presence you felt whenever a sound seemed to bounce back from the silence. A subtle nod to the intricate, often mundane, workings of natural resonance. A goddess of quiet reflection, making sure the world was a consistently responsive place to drift off in. Let's gently consider Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice, innocence, and purity. You might imagine her as a stern, unwavering figure. However, her story is one of quiet retreat, a subtle withdrawal from an increasingly troubled world. For much of her existence, especially in the later ages, Astrea was less about actively enforcing justice and more about symbolizing its diminishing presence, patiently awaiting a time when she might return. She was the quiet conscience of the world, gradually fading into the background. Imagine Astrea's typical day during the so-called Golden Age. She's not presiding over a grand courtroom. She's simply there, a pervasive, gentle presence ensuring that humanity lived in harmony, without the need for complex laws or harsh punishments. In that idyllic time, her influence meant that people acted justly almost instinctively. As the ages grew darker, however, her role became less about active guidance and more about quiet observation. You wouldn't see her striking down evildoers. You'd notice the increasing weight of human dishonesty, the growing distance from that initial purity she embodied. One quirky tidbit about Astrea is her eventual ascent to the heavens to become the constellation Virgo. This wasn't a triumphant return home, but a melancholic departure. As humanity descended through the Silver and Bronze Ages, becoming more warlike and less virtuous, Astrea became increasingly saddened by the injustice she witnessed. Her departure symbolized the fading of true innocence from the earth, a quiet resignation rather than a dramatic escape. It's the divine equivalent of someone quietly closing the door and leaving a party that's gotten too rowdy for their taste. Astrea wasn't typically worshipped with grand, public festivals. Her presence was more inherent in the moral fabric of society, a concept rather than a cult. Her influence was felt in the occasional spark of kindness in a darkening world, or the longing for a simpler, more virtuous past. Her power wasn't in commanding armies, but in representing the pure, uncorrupted essence of justice, a beacon of what once was and what might again be. Historians still argue whether the myth of Astrea reflected a nostalgic view of a lost golden age or served as a philosophical commentary on humanity's moral decline. But for you, as you drift deeper into sleep, you can appreciate the quiet sorrow of a goddess whose sole purpose was to uphold an ideal that, sadly, became too heavy for the world to bear. Her influence was like a soft, pervasive hum in the background of existence, ensuring that even as the world grew louder and more discordant, the memory of true justice and purity lingered, however faintly. She rarely made grand, public pronouncements, preferring the quiet observation of humanity's moral journey. She was the deity you didn't explicitly pray to for retribution, but whose quiet presence you felt whenever a moment of profound fairness occurred, or when you yearned for a time when things were simply right. A goddess of quiet hope and wistful memory, making sure the world, even in its complexities, never entirely forgot its purest beginnings. Finally, let's explore the incredibly subtle, often forgotten roles of liminal deities, those minor gods and spirits who guarded thresholds, boundaries, and quiet, transitional spaces. You won't find them with grand temples or epic myths. Their existence was woven into the very fabric of ancient daily life, a constant, almost imperceptible presence in the quiet moments of transition. They were the divine caretakers of the in-between. Imagine a liminal deity's typical day. They're not engaging in dramatic Olympian feuds or inspiring grand heroic quests. Instead, You'd find them silently watching over a doorway as you cross from outside to inside, or perhaps safeguarding the quiet intersection of a road and a path. Their job was to ensure smooth transitions, to protect the vulnerable moments when one state shifts to another. It's less about direct action and more about a pervasive, protective aura. You wouldn't see them. You'd just feel a subtle sense of safety as you pass through a gate, or a quiet reassurance that a journey's beginning was also its secure end. One quirky tidbit about these deities is their sheer number and specialization. There were gods of the hinge, Cardea, of the threshold, Limeninus, of the street corner, Compitales, and even of the quiet moment when a child first speaks, Fabulinus. This proliferation of specific, minor deities highlights a profound ancient understanding of the sacredness of even the smallest transitions and the importance of subtle spiritual guardianship. It's the divine equivalent of having a tiny, specialized guardian for every single step of your morning routine, from opening your front door to taking that first sip of coffee. Remember how some cultures believed in a household spirit that watched over the pantry? These liminal deities were that. But for every almost imperceptible shift, these deities weren't typically worshipped with grand, public festivals. Their reverence was deeply personal and integrated into daily routines. You might offer a small libation at a crossroads, or simply acknowledge their presence with a silent prayer as you stepped over a threshold. Their power wasn't in commanding armies, but in providing a sense of quiet security and order in the flow of everyday life. Historians still argue whether the veneration of liminal deities reflected a deep-seated human need for safety in transition, or simply the ancient world's meticulous attempt to categorize every aspect of existence. But for you, as you drift deeper into sleep, you can appreciate the quiet comfort of knowing that even the most mundane passages of life had their subtle, divine guardians. Their influence was like a soft, pervasive hum in the background of existence, ensuring that every crossing, every beginning, and every end was gently overseen. They rarely made grand, public pronouncements, preferring the quiet watchfulness of their assigned spaces. They were the deities you didn't explicitly pray to for dramatic intervention, but whose quiet presence you felt whenever you passed through a doorway or began a new endeavor, a subtle nod to the intricate, often mundane, workings of everyday safety and flow. A host of quiet guardians, making sure the world was a consistently secure place to traverse, even in your dreams. And now, as the gentle stories of these quiet deities fade, allow the last whispers of their ancient world to dissolve around you. Feel the subtle currents of sleep, like the soft breeze carrying the scent of olive groves, washing over you. Imagine the quiet glow of Hestia's hearth, a steady, warm comfort settling deep within your own being. Let the peaceful rustle of Pan's forest calm any lingering thoughts, each breath a gentle sigh of the wind through ancient trees. The quiet, gentle hum of Morpheus's meticulous work is now weaving your own peaceful dreams, a tapestry of soothing imagery. All the subtle forces of the ancient world are now aligning to guide you into the deepest, most restorative slumber. Feel your muscles relax, your mind grow quiet, as if you were gently floating down a slow-moving river, effortlessly carried into the stillness of the night. There is nothing left to do, nowhere else to be. Just rest,